welcome. You're watching Global Lens on News9 Live with me, Neha Khanna, and our big focus on the show today are the massive protests that are taking place in Israel against a controversial legislation that has been proposed by the Netanyahu government. In one of the biggest protests against Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's controversial justice system reforms, tens of thousands of Israelis gathered in Tel Aviv, Israel's top business hub, over the weekend. This comes ahead of the first of the three votes that are set to take place in the Knesset, that's the Israeli parliament. This is a challenge that Prime Minister Netanyahu has been facing since January this year, when the first wave of protests began. That's when Netanyahu's far-right government announced its plans to overhaul the judiciary. Critics of the proposed legislation argue that it would significantly diminish the powers of the Supreme Court and grant the ruling coalition excessive influence in appointing judges and even overruling unfavorable verdicts from the court. Let's take a detailed look at why these bills are so controversial and why Israelis are on the streets. There are two bills in question. The first bill aims to take away the Supreme Court's power to strike down Israel's basic laws, which function as the country's constitution. This power to review the legality of laws is similar to the power of judicial review vested with the Indian courts. The other bill allows the government to choose judges by altering the composition of a collegium-like 9-member committee which selects judges. The government's aim is to reduce the influence of legal professionals and give elected representatives and appointees of the government an automatic majority. Why do critics, that is, the opposition, many in the legal fraternity and rights activists, believe that these reforms are downright dangerous? One, the power of the Supreme Court to review or throw out laws would be weakened with a simple majority of just one in the Knesset. That means the government would be able to overrule any court decision that is unpalatable to it. Two, the government would have a decisive say over who becomes a judge, including in the Supreme Court, by increasing its representation on the committee which appoints judges. Ministers would not be required to obey the advice of their legal advisors, guided by the Attorney General, something that they currently have to do by law. And remember, one controversial reform has already been passed into law, removing the power of the Attorney General to pronounce a sitting Prime Minister unfit for office. There has been widespread speculation that the Attorney General was preparing to do exactly that with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu due to a conflict of interest between these reforms and the Prime Minister's ongoing trial for alleged corruption. The procedure for the passage of these bills in the Knesset is marked by 3 readings of the bill or 3 votes. Critics say the proposed legislation is being rushed through so that it can be finalized into law by the close of the Knesset summer session on the 30th of July. They also fear that Netanyahu wants to leverage the judicial push to freeze or cancel his own trial, an accusation the Prime Minister denies. Then there are the critical factors. The ruling coalition in Israel views the judiciary as a left-leaning obstacle to its legislative agenda. Netanyahu's government has claimed that Israelis have lost faith in the legal system and that his reform plans would restore power to elected representatives instead of interventionist and unelected judges. Reports say the government seeks to use this power to override the Supreme Court to get rid of rulings outlawing Israeli outposts on private Palestinian land, for instance, and curtailing social reforms, including those impacting the LGBTQ community. Critics argue that these judicial reforms will give the legislature unbridled powers and make it immune from any system of checks and balances. The question is this: is it only a matter of time before these bills are signed into law? What will such a law mean for Israel's judiciary and its society? Will it mean the end of all judicial oversight for the far-right ruling coalition and with it the government's accountability? Will such a law impinge on civil liberties? Will it take Israel on the path of unchecked authoritarianism? Could another fallout be a far worsening of the Israel-Palestine conflict? Also, faced with unprecedented protests, what does this political challenge mean for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his far-right coalition government? All right, we are joined by a very special panel of guests tonight, all experts from Israel. Let me in fact quickly introduce them. We have with us Professor Yaniv Roznai, a constitutional expert, also co-director at the Rubinstein Center for Constitutional Challenges at the Reichman University. We have with us Gil Hoffman, a political analyst and former chief political correspondent with the Jerusalem Post, and completing the panel tonight is Professor Avi Bell, professor of law at Bar-Ilan University and at University of San Diego. He is also a constitutional law expert. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. I will come to you in just a moment, but before that, let's listen in to what Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said about these nationwide protests.
הממשלה תקבל היום עדכון מהיועצת המשפטית לממשלה וגורמי האכיפה לגבי מדיניות האכיפה כלפי איומים ופגיעה בנבחרי ציבור, קריאות למרי אזרחי ואי ציות לחוק, חסימות כבישים ושביתות בלתי חוקיות. הזכות להפגין במסגרת החוק היא זכות מקודשת לכל אדם ולכל ציבור, ואנחנו מגנים בתוקף כל אלימות כלפי מפגינים מצד זה או אחר. הזכות הזאת שמורה הן למתנגדי הרפורמה והן לתומכיה. הממשלה לא מעלה על דעתה להגביל זכות זאת, אבל הממשלה כן מבקשת לקבל דיווח מהי מדיניות האכיפה ביחס להפרות החוק. ביחס להפרות חוק שפוגעות בזכויות היסוד של מיליוני אזרחים ושמתבצעות כמעט על בסיס יומי במהלך ההפגנות. הממשלה תאשר היום את השתתפותנו בוועידת האקלים קופ 28, ועידה בינלאומית שתתקיים באיחוד האמירויות. אנחנו מחויבים למאמץ הבינלאומי החשוב הזה להפחתת מזהמים ולהגנת הסביבה.
Mainly what worries me is that the essence of this revolution that they're trying to pull, that they're trying to give a lot more power to the government than they should. And therefore, when the government has unlimited power and when there's not enough balance, then they can do whatever they want. And it can be this government, it can be another government. But I think instead of looking out for this country, they're looking out for themselves.
We are not against the reform, but reform is a cover for taking over. Yes, there is things that you can change, our judge system, or everywhere you can make change, which is good, but not like that. This is completely a plan to take Israel, to make it like the Middle Age, and we are fighting against everybody in this Middle East to stay as we are, and we don't want to be Iranian.
I would love America to support us. I would love if there is any kind of way that they can put pressure on the Israel government. I would love that to happen. I don't know how it's going to happen, but it's important to I think, support Israel right now because we are the only democracy in the Middle East. And if this collapsing, I don't know what will happen here, and it's not going to be good even for America. So I think it's not only like a local cause. This is going to affect.
All right, we have a terrific panel of experts from Israel who will put this issue into perspective for us. Professor Yaniv Roznai, let me start with you. Sir, why is there so much anger on the streets of Israel over these proposed laws? Why do critics believe that these laws are downright dangerous? Will it be the end of all judicial oversight for Benjamin Netanyahu's ruling coalition? Will it be the end of government's accountability?
I think that the people are angry because what the government has put forward is the most extreme package of reforms. And that is, I think, the main problem. The government has chosen the most extreme reforms possible in every aspect. So limiting judicial review, only a supermajority of judges would be able to declare a law unconstitutional, which would in a way make judicial review ineffective. Abolishing judicial review of basic laws, something like the Indian basic structure doctrine, just that in Israel, a basic law can be enacted just in an ordinary law with a simple majority in a single day. Capturing the court by replacing the judges and allowing the coalition to appoint its own judges. All this together accumulatively would simply mean that the coalition, that the governing coalition, has almost absolute powers. Now, the big problem is that anyway, the starting point of Israeli constitutional order is in any way relatively weak compared to other countries. We, as you know, we do not have any rigid constitution or a rigid Bill of Rights. We do not have two houses in parliament. We are not a federal country. We are not subordinated to any supranational institution or a court. And accordingly, anyway, the executive, the cabinet, the government has already quite a lot of powers because it controls the legislature, the parliament. And in this setting, any change whatsoever now that would provide more power to the to the executive on the expense of the judiciary would put Israeli democracy at risk. And that is the big problem, I think, and that is why people are so afraid and angry.
Well, that is what is making people angry, but what really is the way forward? Gil Hoffman, let me ask you a couple of questions. Number one, are these reforms going to inevitably become a law? Is it now only a matter of time? Is the writing on the wall? Number one. Number two, there are many who argue that Netanyahu wants to leverage this law to freeze or cancel his own trial in his corruption cases. Of course, it's an accusation that the Prime Minister has denied. Also, correct me if I'm wrong, one controversial reform has already become a law. It removes the power of the Attorney General to pronounce a sitting Prime Minister unfit for office, and there is widespread speculation in Israel that the Attorney General was going to actually use this law against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Do you agree with that?
Neha, so what you say in your background is correct, but we need to put this into proportion. At the beginning, in January, 6 months ago, the Justice Minister proposed many far-reaching bills, and the only one that's been passed into law is that one about declaring a Prime Minister incapacitated. And now, at best, they're going to try to pass one more law by the Knesset recess beginning at the end of this month. And then there's a 3-month recess. We're already then into the second year after the election. What governments in Israel don't do in their first year, they tend to not get accomplished at all. So after reports that there would be such a sweeping revolution, Netanyahu lost. He wanted to do a lot of things. He wanted perhaps to impact his trial. He can't. It's not happening. The protesters already won. And at some point during that recess, there's going to be more negotiations and compromises. It's not going to be one side forcing down the throat of the other. No side is going to get completely what they want. That's the way it works in democracy.
All right. But, you know, even though you say that the protesters have won, but Professor Avi Bill, let me bring you in here. You know, have the protesters really won? Because if you go by the attitude of the Prime Minister and his coalition of far-right leaders and political parties, it is very clear that they're determined to ramrod this legislation through the Knesset. In fact, it is being said that they want to ensure that this proposed that this bill is signed into law by the 30th of July, before the end of the summer session of the Knesset. And therefore, the question that arises is, are they really paying any attention to the protesters? How do you see this as a political challenge to Benjamin Netanyahu and his far-right government?
The movement for judicial reform didn't begin 6 months ago, and it didn't begin with the elections. It's been going on since the Supreme Court and then the legal advisors to the government began systematically seizing for themselves absolute unreviewable powers contrary to the law. So, for example, you said there's legal authority for the legal advisor to declare the Prime Minister incapacitated. There's no such law. There's no such authority. The legal advisor had threatened to do so, notwithstanding the fact that there's no legal authority. Now, steps like this, the seizure of unlimited power by the Supreme Court and by the legal advisors, has gradually eroded faith among the Israeli public in these institutions. It used to be that the Supreme Court was widely trusted by more than 80% of the public. Now it's distrusted by most of the Israeli public. Nearly 90% distrust the legal advisors. There is going to be some change. And I think that it's precisely because this government is listening to the majority of the Israeli public that wants to restore parliamentary democracy, to restore checks and balances, to restore separation of powers, to return the executive authority to the executive, to return the parliamentary authority to the parliament, and leave the judiciary intact as one of the strongest judiciaries in the world, but this time without executive and parliamentary authority.
Okay, it's interesting. You say that this government is listening to the people of Israel. But if it was really listening to the people of Israel, why would tens of thousands of people be taking to the streets? We've seen these protests since the month of January, and the latest protests erupted as recently as over the weekend in Tel Aviv, ahead of the first reading on this bill in the Knesset. Also, you say that, the government wants to restore checks and balances. The biggest fear that's been expressed by the critics is that it takes away all checks and balances. But my job is just to play the devil's advocate. So, Professor Yaniv Roznai, these are the two sides of this debate. The government and its supporters say that Israelis have lost faith in the legal and judicial system. That is an argument that's being advanced by Professor Avi Bell as well. And therefore, these reform plans would restore power to the elected representatives who represent the will of the people instead of quote-unquote interventionist and unelected judges. On the other hand, those who are bitterly opposed to these reforms say that these legislations will give the government unbridled powers and make it completely immune from any system of checks and balances. How does one view this issue?
Yes, it is indeed a very complicated issue. I want to refer perhaps at the beginning to one point. It is true that the public confidence in the judiciary has been decreasing in the last 30 years or so. But one must be honest and say that the public trust or confidence in the political branches is much lower than the public trust in the judiciary, which is almost as in other countries. So I'm not very sure how politicizing the judiciary would increase public trust or confidence in the court. Just the opposite, I believe. And I'm also not so sure that the government is listening to the people. In all the recent surveys in the last 6 months, a vast majority of Israelis oppose this judicial overhaul. Now, what is most frustrating for me as a law professor, it is quite easily to reach a compromise, a consensus reform, a good reform for Israel. But it's not this reform. It is not this reform because this is not a reform. Reforming is improving, creating something that is better and not destroying the system. And unfortunately, this is very much what's going to happen if this so-called reform passes. And I've heard before that it was said that as if the protest has won and the government is posing with the legislation. But no, this is not the case. The government simply changes tactic. From a one big blitz, a whole package of the reform, they are simply changing to a more incremental process, piece by piece. But when we see around the world what's going on and how democracies are eroded, it is precisely through this incremental process. And this is why we are still very much afraid about this process.
Okay. Gil Hoffman, let me come to you now. Will this law, once it becomes a reality, you believe impinge on civil liberties of Israeli citizens? And could another fallout be a far worsening of the Israel-Palestine conflict? Why do I ask that? Because there are reports that suggest that the government wants to use this power that it hopes to derive from this new law to override many Supreme Court rulings, such as the one that banned Israeli outposts on private Palestinian land and curtailing social reforms, including those impacting the LGBTQ community. And a lot has been said and written about how this is a coalition of ultra-nationalists and far-right leaders?
Neha, I think that you're taking it too far and you're giving the government too much credit that it can be effective. We were talking about a bill dealing with reasonableness of legislation and appointments that the Supreme Court has taken for itself the ability to use that as a concept to disqualify such decisions. They've only used it an average of once a year over the last 20 years for really, really uncontroversial things like requiring the government to secure schools in the periphery around Gaza where they were firing rockets. I don't see a change overnight to be able to now take steps against the Palestinians or against the LGBT community. Netanyahu is very strongly against that. He made sure to appoint a Speaker of the Parliament who, upon accepting his post, pointed out his husband of 18 years and their two sons on his lap and said, "I will never let any harm be done to these children or any children, period." There are so many eulogies now for Israeli democracy that's been strong since 1948, the same year that India was formed. And look, the fact that there have been on the streets of Israel now for more than half a year every Saturday night, such a huge amount of protesters, 100,000, 200,000, that's in such a small country, that's the equivalent of, in India, there would be 75 million people on the streets every single week for a year. It's just incredible. It shows that Israeli democracy is strong, and that's not going to change anytime soon.
You're saying the protests show that the Israeli democracy is robust, but the protests also show us that there is a lot of anger and that these so-called judicial reforms are deeply unpopular. How come that message is not being taken away by the government? Professor Avibe, like I said at the start of the show, my job is to play the devil's advocate. So I'm going to ask you to respond to what Professor Yaniv Roznai has said. You said that the faith of the Israeli people in the judicial system has plummeted in recent years. He says, while that may be true, but people's faith in the elected representatives and the political class is in fact much lower. And these measures that are being taken by the Netanyahu government is exactly how erosion of democracy occurs. Isn't it true, sir, that even Israel's own president, Isaac Herzog, has expressed his concerns or reservations about these so-called judicial reforms? He has urged the government to arrive at a compromise with the opposition. The closest ally that Israel has, the United States, has been very critical of these proposed reforms.
Well, again, all of these proposed reforms have been around for decades. They were, in many instances, matters of consensus. Now, what we're looking at is the polarization that has happened across the Western world, where people are no longer viewing themselves, where they are in opposition to the elected authorities, as part of the same state. They're viewing themselves as a resistance. They describe themselves as such. And you're seeing very vocal protests against on matters of a sense of identity. That said, Israel is democracy, and as much as it's important to recognize the right of people to go into the streets and protest loudly about what they want, ultimately the people express their views at the ballot box. They have a right to vote. They have a right to express themselves first, a right to vote, and then to get the government that they elected to carry out within the bounds of the law the policies for which they voted. The people voted for this government. They expect that government to carry out the policies for which they voted. And I have to say about what Professor Roznai said about public confidence in the court. Now, there's a recent study by some colleagues of ours at the Hebrew University about public trust in the courts. What it's shown is that the public trust in the courts in Israel has dropped faster than anywhere else in the democratic world, and as a result, of the hyperactivism of the court. There is a way to restore trust. And I have to say, by the way, about trust in political institutions, what you see actually in the polls is, while there's a great deal of distrust of political institutions in the abstract, the majority of people continue to have trust in their elected representatives, more than have trust in the court, certainly more than have trust in law enforcement in Israel. The way a democracy works is that you never expect unanimity. You expect a majority to go for some things, and then the majority flips over. It is a fact that 96.5% of the members of the current parliament are either in the governing in parties that are in the governing coalition right now, or are in parties that were in the governing coalition in the past year. There's a turnover. Majorities get to do what they do, and then another majority that has a different agenda gets to do what it wants to do. What's changed in Israel is not judicial reform. What's changed is that people are digging in their heels to try to justify the unreasonable, unlimited powers that the court has taken, contrary to democracy, and in a way that is done nowhere else in the democratic world. There is no country in the world other than Israel, where the Supreme Court has declared for itself the power to strike down parliamentary legislation without a written constitution. It could never happen in the other countries without a written constitution, like the UK or New Zealand. It's simply outrageous, and it's no wonder that the majority of people have lost trust.
Okay, a majority of people, you insist, have lost trust in the courts, yet you admit that the people we see on the streets, are you saying unreasonably demanding that the judiciary be allowed to hang on to its power. So I honestly see a bit of a contradiction there in your argument. Why else would these protesters be on the streets if they did not have faith in the judiciary? And you also made a very interesting argument. You said the people voted for this government, so they of course will accept whatever this government brings in. Correct me if I'm wrong. Some might argue this is a ragtag coalition of far-right forces that was forged after the Israeli election results came in. But let me take this back to Professor Yaniv Roznai. Professor Roznai, is this the message to take away from the protest? That look, Israeli democracy is alive and kicking, it is robust, because we're still allowing tens of thousands of people to take to the streets. But the messaging about the judiciary seems to be a very confused one if we were to go by the argument that's being advanced by Professor Avi Bell. What do you make of it?
The message is that Israel is still a robust democracy, and we want to keep it like that. We want to make it more democratic. We do not want to undermine it. Now, Professor Bell correctly said that this is an elected government that has the right and the authority to advance its policies. But just like in India, there is a basic structure doctrine from Kesavananda Bharati onwards that the core values of the constitutional order cannot be changed. So we, the people of Israel, are not willing to allow undermining of the basic principles of the state as a Jewish and democratic country. It's as that simple. We are not against any reform. We are not against more power to politicians. We are against reforms that would completely undermine the checks and balances of the country and would provide absolute powers to the executive. This is unacceptable, and this is the main message.
One more question for you, Professor Roznai, before I take this back to the other panelists. Gil Hoffman said that I'm giving the Netanyahu government too much credit when I ask, are they trying to get rid of crucial Supreme Court rulings, such as the one that outlaws Israeli outposts on private Palestinian land and curtailing social reforms, including those that impact the LGBTQ community? Those are fears that have been expressed by critics of these so-called reforms. What is your take on that? Will there be an impact on civil liberties?
Without a doubt, civil liberties, I think, would be at risk if this reform would be carried on, because our court has so far been relatively restrained when reviewing legislation of the Knesset. We are talking about 30 years since the constitutional revolution, and the court has only invalidated 22 provisions of laws. But these are precisely those laws that the government want to enact without any limitations. Taking private property of Palestinians, undermining minorities' rights, etc. And we want to protect our fundamental rights. And as I've mentioned earlier, unlike any other democracy in the world, we do not have a rigid Bill of Rights. Even fundamental rights such as equality or free speech are not implicitly included in our basic laws. So if there is any reform that is needed, is to provide better protection for our rights and more checks and balances on governmental power, not the opposite.
Okay, you want to respond to that, Gil Hoffman? He says that, these laws are going to impinge on civil liberties without a doubt and jeopardize the Israeli citizens' fundamental rights. He says we need more laws to protect them, not less.
I expect there to be negotiations between the supporters and opponents of the bills. What happened before was that it was not necessarily the quantitative protests of hundreds of thousands of protesters that had an impact, but more so the qualitative protesters, the pilots and the leaders of the Israeli economy who forced Netanyahu to compromise. The credit agencies said to Netanyahu, we are lowering not the credit rating of Israel, but the horizon, because you are trying to move forward with plans that a majority of the people of Israel are not in favor of. But if you do things by consensus, then we'll bring that horizon back to positive. If you do them not by consensus, we will lower that credit rating. So that's where Netanyahu stands right now. Fitch is coming back, a credit agency, next week. And so don't be surprised if the current bill they're proposing ends up getting changed because of that and because of a statement by President Biden. Yesterday, there was very much an alert to Netanyahu, and then there'll be a 3-month break, and then both sides will go back to the president's residence. And the people who support Professor Rosenai's point of view and the people who support Professor Bell's point of view will get together, and no more bills are going to pass until a consensus is reached between the two of them.
But, Gil Hoffman, you are saying that ultimately there will have to be a consensus, but the present situation doesn't seem to point in that direction, because while you have these tens of thousands of supporters who are on the streets, who obviously feel unseen and unheard, there are also those who are saying that the government is doing its best to ramrod these legislations through the Knesset by the 30th of July. Correct me if I'm wrong, even after the president tried to intervene and told the government and the Prime Minister that some sort of a compromise should be reached with the opposition parties, no, those efforts went absolutely nowhere. Therefore, where is the scope for that elusive consensus that you talk about?
I think that it will still happen. They've tried to ramrod, as you said. It didn't work. Now they're going to try one bill. Okay, so 2 bills in 6 months. That is not very impressive, Neha. In the end of the day, when you've got a country that's so divided, we have to be able to unite. We have a president who is the president elected by the widest majority in Israel's history, including those who ran unopposed. If anyone can do it, he can do it. And he didn't succeed yet, but I still have faith that he will.
Okay, your faith remains strong and unshaken, but I don't think Professor Rosenai shares either your faith or your optimism. But Professor Avi Bell, let me come to you now. Now, very quickly, for the benefit of our viewers, if I could just mention that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu faces corruption cases in Israel. He is charged with fraud, breach of trust, and accepting bribes in 3 separate scandals involving powerful media moguls and wealthy associates. He denies wrongdoing. Now, it's not me saying this, but again, critics of these proposed reforms say Netanyahu is hell-bent on weakening the judiciary because he is looking for an escape route from his own trial. How would you respond to that?
The trials are somewhat interesting. In the last week and a half, We heard reports that the judges are advising prosecutors to drop bribery charges because they can't possibly win. I don't believe that there's any merit to these trials. I've said so previously. I actually spoke to the Attorney General before charges were filed. I said that these are not charges that should be filed in any liberal democracy. To try to punish media outlets for giving positive coverage and calling that a bribe is simply not something that should be done. But I have faith that the court system will eventually throw out these meritless charges. But that's not the issue. Again, the judicial reform bills were not first proposed by Netanyahu, and nor were they first proposed in the last year. This is an old issue that has been working through the system for many, many, many years. Some of these proposals were proposed by members of opposition parties, by Daniel Friedman, who was Justice Minister almost 20 years ago in a left-wing coalition. All of these things are absolutely necessary and long-standing. There's no attempt here and no possible success in trying to ramrod anything through. What you're looking through is, after a very, very long period of time, the beginning of a debate in the Knesset. One bill will perhaps pass by the end of June, not the entirety of the reform, not even the majority of the reform. What's going to pass is perhaps a little bit. And I have to address one other thing that you said, that Professor Rosnai said, and I think it's really a terrible, terrible bit of misinformation. There is nothing whatsoever in these bills that tries to limit or in any way addresses civil liberties. What I can say is that Professor Rosnai is, along with others who are anti-judicial reform, are arguing that civil liberties are in danger because the only way to protect civil liberties in the world is to have a judiciary that acts as a benign aristocracy that protects those rights, rather than having a robust democratic system. And I think that's absolutely wrong. The Supreme Court in Israel has taken away as many liberties as it's granted. The Supreme Court in Israel has eroded the rights of the criminally accused. It has shut down opposition radio stations on grounds that are difficult to justify under a rule of law. And of course, in Israel, thanks to the power that the judiciary has seized, when it violates civil rights, nobody can complain, nobody can correct it. And I think for that reason, if there's any result that's going to come from judicial reform about civil liberties, it's going to be that it's going to improve them. The protection of civil liberties should return to the people. There is nobody who is more zealous of their own rights than the people themselves.
Except those people are right now on the streets of Israel. I don't know whose dog has been barking on the show, but I'd just like to say he or she is certainly welcome on the show. But on a more serious note, final question to you, Professor Bell. How do you respond to those who say that these laws are going to set Israel on the path of unchecked authoritarianism, pretty much the way Hungary and Poland have moved in recent years? And what do you make of the fact that Israel's closest ally, the United States, and President Joe Biden have been critical of this judicial overhaul?
So the judicial reform, it's important to remember, is designed to get Israel
that question is for
system.
Professor Bell. Yes, go ahead, sir.
Yes, is designed to get Israel back to the system of parliamentary democracy that it had before the judiciary seized all these powers during the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s. So the idea that somehow or another Israel is going to become an autocracy if it returns back to the same system of parliamentary democracy it had in the 1980s is preposterous. Of course it's not going to. The only institution in Israel that has unchecked, unlimited powers today is the judiciary. The parliament was supreme under the old system, but it never had unchecked powers. It had to go back to the people. And I remind you that there's never been a case in Israeli history, and it's not likely to happen anytime in the near future, where any party has ever won a majority of the parliament. The parliamentary system in Israel is not one of absolute power. It's one of negotiations. It's one of consensus. One of the bizarre things that you see here is the demand that rather than working things out in the Knesset, which is an institution that forces consensus, it has to be taken somewhere else. It has to be taken to the streets, where people who are shutting down transportation, who are attempting to intimidate, even trap in their homes, members of the parliament, who are threatening violence and calling to kill people, including me, by the way, that those people have to be convinced. Well, they do not have to be. What we will get is a consensus ultimately of the majority of the public. And if the public is ultimately not happy with this, there will be elections. They can choose someone else.
Okay, well, one thing has to be stated here after what Professor Bell has said. Violence or threats of violence, no matter which side they come from, are simply unacceptable. There can be no justification for it. Professor Yaniv Roznai, as I wrap up this discussion, since this was 2 versus 1, I think it's only fair that I give you the last word, and I'm sure the other guests would not mind it. Professor Roznai, my question to you simply is, your fellow panelists continue to insist that there is ultimately going to be a consensus. Do you believe there is still hope for that the protesters and what they are trying to say, the concerns that they are expressing for Israel's democracy, may finally be considered by this government, or do you think that that's really being too optimistic?
So just to respond to Professor Bell's point, the earlier one, look, we see what's happening around the world now. I haven't seen any democracy collapses because the court was over-activist in its jurisprudence. I've seen many democracies eroding and collapsing because of executive aggrandizement. The executive taking more and more powers to itself, and that is the fear. Now, I'm naturally an optimistic, and I'm extremely optimistic in seeing this liberal renewal and watching those people in the streets shouting for judicial independence and fundamental rights and separation of power. So I'm extremely optimistic thanks to these hundreds of thousands of people who've been for the last 6 months every week in the streets, in the hundreds of thousands, and peaceful protest. And this is quite amazing, and that makes me quite optimistic. I really hope that the government will come back to its senses and will sit down with the opposition to reach some kind of a consensus, a reform in a consensus. It's possible, it's in reach, and I really hope that this will be the case.
Okay, so clearly optimism is not in short supply on this panel. Despite the differences of opinion, one thing we can all agree on is that hope springs eternal, and democracy is always about dialogue and debate. On that note, I have to say here, gentlemen, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you all on the show and to have those varying perspectives on what is clearly a burning issue in Israel at the moment. Professor Yaniv Roznai, Gil Hoffman, Professor Avi Bell, thank you so much for your time and perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, that's all the time we have on this segment of the show. But this is, of course, a story we'll continue to track very closely here on Global Lens on News 9 Live. Time for us to slip into a short break, but don't go anywhere. There's more on the other side.
He thought he could outlast us. And 1 year later,